Okay, so topic now, photosynthesis. So we just finished up cellular respiration. We spent a day talking about general characteristics of cellular respiration, and then we went into details, and that's exactly how we've divided this up. So first of all, what do you know about photosynthesis? Perfect. Okay, so big picture, we're taking energy and we're turning it into food, which is the exact opposite of cellular respiration, where we took food and turned it into energy. Now, when you said we, you didn't mean like us, because what type of organisms carry out photosynthesis? Okay, so plants is true, but I want something more vague. Autotrophs. What is an autotroph? Self-feeding. Based on our word roots alone, if you saw the word autotroph, auto would mean self, troph would mean feeding, you would know that that was a self-feeding organism. What about where photosynthesis takes place? No? No idea? Okay, there are electron carriers, but what about the physical location? Chloroplast, yes. So that's just general, that most people kind of have an idea about photosynthesis, and of course, I'm going to take you to the next level on that. But we'll start with its general location for the process, and I've added a little bit more detail as far as what type of organisms can conduct. So you already said autotrophic, and I added eukaryotes. Why, for chloroplasts, did I add eukaryotes? So it's autotrophs, you're correct. But why did I put autotrophic eukaryotes if they have a chloroplast? It's a membrane-bound organelle. And the only type of cells that have membrane-bound organelles are eukaryotic. So to be more specific, organisms that have chloroplasts are autotrophic eukaryotes. Now, you're not wrong when you say plants, but there are also other eukaryotes that are autotrophic, namely protists. Algae or seaweed, a lot of people tend to think that that's a plant, but seaweed or algae is not a plant. It's a protist. If you were to take a big algae plant, sea algae, out of the water and put it on land, what would it do? It would dry up. Would it stay really tall? No, because it's not a plant. Plants have vascular tissue and they can stand up tall. But protists, they don't. So as soon as you take them out of water, they just flop over. So the collegiate way to reference photosynthetic organisms is to say they're autotrophic eukaryotes, and that encompasses both plants and protists. But there's also, we studied this in a previous lab, cyanobacteria, which is what type of cell? It is a single cell, cyanobacteria. It's prokaryotic. It's a bacteria. So does it have membrane-bound organelles? No. So how does it carry out any metabolic function? The plasma membrane, just like we spoke on for the mitochondria. So if they're an autotrophic prokaryote, they use their plasma membrane to conduct this process because they don't have a chloroplast, because they're not eukaryotic. Okay? So when we spoke on the mitochondria, I said it was a very unique organelle because it had its own genetic material and it also had two membranes. I bet you can't guess what other organelle on Earth has its own genetic material and two membranes. A mitochondria, yes, but also a chloroplast. So we've already studied mitochondria, and now we're moving on to chloroplasts. Chloroplasts have the same characteristics of mitochondria, meaning they have their own genetic material, and they have two cell membranes. And how do we explain that again? It was once a bacteria just hanging out, doing chloroplast bacteria stuff, and what happened to it? It didn't get eaten. Engulfed. The process is called endocytosis. What's the theory that explains this? Endosymbiotic theory. The endosymbiotic theory says that these bacteria were hanging out, and a bigger bacteria phagocytized, which is a type of endocytosis, phagocytized the smaller bacteria or engulfed it, and we know it was engulfed and not consumed because it was still alive. Okay? So this organelle indeed has its own genetic material. It also has two membranes. Its original plasma membrane and the remnant of the vesicle that it was brought in with. Okay? So chloroplasts are quite unique, and just so you know, there's not another organelle that has that. So mitochondria and chloroplasts are those only two. So you've already answered this, but here I have it in writing because, you know, I like to have everything in writing. What type of organisms conduct photosynthesis? And the correct answer is autotrophic. Autotrophic. But it's biology, and we can't just be basic and say autotrophic. So to be a little bit more specific, I'm going to add photo in front of it. And what does photo mean? Light. So phototrophs or photoautotrophs use light to feed themselves. And just by knowing those word roots alone, you could decipher that. Okay? So I mentioned that autotrophs use energy, just like Ashley mentioned, use energy to make food. They use energy to make food. Photoautotrophs use light as their source. Examples of photoautotrophs, plants, which we covered. Protists, which are like your algae, your seaweeds, euglena, and so on. And then cyanobacteria. And then I naturally just wanted to add in a heterotroph so that you knew the opposite of autotroph is heterotroph. Which classification are you and I? Hetero. Yeah, we're hetero. And we've already discussed how cool it would be to be autotrophic. But nonetheless, we're just not cool. Questions so far on the chloroplast or the type of organisms that conduct photosynthesis? All right? So here is our equation for photosynthesis. And the equation for photosynthesis, just as I did previously, my reactants are on the left, and so I put their molecular formula there, but for myself personally, I write underneath them what they are. It will help you in a test situation, especially when you've memorized a lot of material, to make yourself notes. So yes, I could look at that and say that's carbon dioxide, but when I'm looking through 4 answer choices, I do get confused. It may be it's just me, but I get confused. So CO2 is my carbon dioxide, water is H2O. Those are my reactants. Those are going in. The process of photosynthesis is conducted, and my products are C6H12O6, which we know as glucose, and O2, which is oxygen. Which of these is an organic molecule? Glucose is an organic molecule. It's an organic molecule. So remember, to be organic means that you have carbon, but just because you have carbon doesn't mean you organic. We had talked about that. Like carbon dioxide is inorganic. But glucose is a carbohydrate. Remember, we have 4 organic molecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So when we get further in the notes and it says, oh, we're using something inorganic to create organic, you know what I'm talking about. So in this whole equation, the organic molecule is the glucose. Okay? Is there anything slightly familiar about this equation? It is 100% the opposite of cellular respiration. So I could just say that, or I could show you. You have to know both equations, but if you know one, you really know both. So pick the one you like the best. Do you like cellular respiration, where you're taking food to make energy? Or do you like photosynthesis, where you're taking energy and converting it into food? Whichever one you enjoy more, memorize. And then the other one is truly just flipped, 100% flipped. Okay? So if you read my diagram here for photosynthesis, these are my reactants because my arrow is going in this direction, and these are my products. For cellular respiration, the arrow is going this direction, so these are my reactants, and these are my products. Again, I choose to take the term and specifically indicate to myself what it is. Your test question will be something like this. Which of the following are the reactants for cellular respiration? And so you'll have 4 answer choices, and sometimes they're just the words, and sometimes they're the molecular formula. So on the back of my answer document, I would put CO2, carbon dioxide. And then I would write the 2 equations, because if you have it written, then you can keep referring back to it. Does that make sense? So I would say, okay, my reactants for cellular respiration. Reactants are what go in for cellular respiration. You're going to have 4 answer choices, and the answer choices will be something like glucose and water, glucose and carbon dioxide, okay, glucose and oxygen, and you'll have to figure out which ones are correct. And it doesn't seem like it's difficult, but when you have all those numbers jumbled around, it does kind of get confusing. So just a heads up on that. Okay? So again, yes, they are the opposite of one another, and I wanted you to see that. If you know one, you know both. Questions on the equations. All right? So we really didn't have to study the anatomy of a mitochondria, because when we talked about the process of cellular respiration, it kind of just occurred inside the mitochondria. There wasn't really a specific spot. But that's different for photosynthesis. So you do need to be familiar with the general anatomy of a chloroplast. I'm going to start here with one of these green circles. And I choose to call them green pancakes because that's what they look like. Their scientific name is a thylakoid membrane. These thylakoid membranes are hollow. Do you remember what we call an opening? A lumen. So we have a thylakoid membrane, and you'll hear the term thylakoid lumen, which is just the opening inside of it, that open space. Here in a bit, I will show you that the thylakoid membranes are themselves phospholipid bilayers. Okay? So, thylakoid membrane, hollow, has a thylakoid lumen. It is composed of a phospholipid bilayer. Every single one of these is. When you have a stack of thylakoids, you have a stack of thylakoids, we call that a granum with a U-M. A granum is singular. When you reference all the stacks of thylakoids, we say grana. So that's just plural. Again, an individual one is called a thylakoid. A stack is called a granum. All the stacks, grana, plural. Each of these thylakoids is connected or interconnected. They have these little bridges. These bridges are called lamella, and that is spelled L-A-M. I'm going to spell this E-L-E-A. It's on the next slide. Leave yourself a little blank. That's what you get for having a dyslexic teacher. So usually I can spell pretty well outright. Anyways, these little hallways or connectors connect the granum to one another. So as the electrons are moved around, it all stays in house. This open area that's represented here in like a lighter green is the same consistency as cytosol, but cyto means cell. And we're in the chloroplast here, so we're going to call this right here the stroma. The open area is called the stroma, S-T-R-O-M-A. And then my favorite part is just labeling that two membranes, inner membrane and outer membrane. I just love simplicity. I mean, I don't know why we have to make everything so complicated. So, real quick review of the anatomy of a chloroplast. You have individual thylakoids that are composed of a phospholipid bilayer, each one. And they have a hollow middle, which we call a lumen, the thylakoid lumen. A stack of thylakoids is called a granum, U-M, and all the granum together are called grana. It's just plural. The connecting hallways are called lamella. The open area, the stroma, and then you have the inner membrane and the outer membrane. Because again, it has two cell membranes as it once survived on its own. Here is everything I just said in writing. Here's lamella. L-A-M-E-L-L-A. That's what I was struggling with right there. Those are the hallways. But everything that I just pointed out and explained verbally is spelled out here. Okay, questions on the anatomy of a chloroplast, the structure of a chloroplast. Okay. Now, this is very specific to plants. So, and this is also, again, I don't want you just to think that plants are the only photosynthetic organism, because we just discussed that they're not. But we are going to talk about the location of photosynthesis within a plant. And it's what we call the photosynthetic organ. So where in a plant does photosynthesis take place? In a leaf, yes. The leaves of a plant are the photosynthetic organ. I apologize. Can you tell me why it's not the roots? They're underground, which means they don't have access to light. Okay? Now what about the stems? Are stems photosynthetic? The answer is it depends. If it's a woody stem, but what about if it's an herbaceous stem? A green stem. And it's not high levels like the leaves, but there are chloroplasts there, so that it does have the ability to conduct photosynthesis. Now, what we have here is if you took this leaf flat and cut it just like this. So this would be us looking into the leaf. Okay? Let's talk about the structure of a leaf. Why are leaves flat and not round or balled up? It's truly for surface area, to allow themselves access to more sunlight. Now, if you were bored enough one day, I would say you need to take two plants and set them next to each other and watch them, because they truly fight for resources. If you have the two plants and you put a window right here, the one closest to the window will be happy and kind of barely turn to get access to that sunlight. The one further away from the window will bend around the other one. They truly compete on a regular basis for resources, for water, for sunlight, etc. One of the easiest applications I can give you is if you've driven to East Texas or through East Texas. What lines the highways all the way to Louisiana? Tree. What kind of trees? Pine trees. And are they big, thick pine trees? They're big and thick? They're slim and Why so tall? I'm talking like millimeters each day. They're trying to outdo one another. So these pine trees, they're really close together, so they can't grow out this way because there's no space. That's a resource that they're limited on. So they're really close, but they're really tall. And how many baby trees do you think there are at the bottom? 0. Why 0? Why none? There's no sunlight. All these adults are up here competing. No time for babies. There actually is an adaptation for that, just so you know. But pine cones, they're pine tree babies, but you can't just plant it. They have to be caught on fire. They have to be activated. So when pine forests burn, they burn very quickly because pine is highly flammable, the sap. When that happens, it opens the cones and it will allow new trees to germinate. So there's no baby pine trees because they have no resources, and if there was a fire to crack them open, it would burn the adults, and that would be a thing. So, small little tidbit of information, but my point is that the shape of a leaf is extremely important to its job, and that these plants individually compete. There are 2 sections to a leaf when we look at the cross-section. So this model here is this model up close. This is the top of the leaf. This is the bottom of the leaf. Which part of the leaf do you think carries out the most photosynthesis? Why top? It's closer to the sun. Okay, 100% it makes logical sense. What can you tell me about the organization of the cells on the top, bless you, versus the bottom? Why is it so compact here at the top? Why are they all squished together? They're truly trying to compete. It's the same concept of the pine trees. They're pushed here together, trying to access as much sunlight as possible. And you can see that they're really organized. And they don't grow wide, they grow tall. Okay? Now, down here at the bottom, and let me just go ahead and name this for you. This is called the palisade mesophyll, P-A-L-I-S-A-D-E, the palisade mesophyll. It's the part of the leaf that's conducting high levels of photosynthesis. Here at the bottom, there's a lot more space and openness, and we reference that as the spongy mesophyll. And why does that make sense? It kind of looks like it's holy and so on. And then at the very bottom, underneath the spongy mesophyll, is these holes. And these holes are pores. They're the equivalent to the pores that you and I have in our skin. They're called stoma. You may also hear them referenced as stomata. But they're openings. And for the most part, they're at the bottom of the leaf. So I have this leaf. The sun hits the top. It's nice and flat, so it absorbs lots of sunlight. I have the palisade mesophyll right beneath it, conducting high levels of photosynthesis. I have this spongy mesophyll down here at the bottom. Not really as much photosynthesis, although the potential is there to conduct some types of photosynthesis. Here, it's open, and down here I have these pores, these stoma or stomata. What's the purpose of the pores? To breathe, for the plant to breathe. The plant needs to get rid of the oxygen, because oxygen to a plant or a photosynthetic organism is toxic. So as it's making it, it needs to release it. And what gas does it need to bring in? Carbon dioxide. So these stomata or stoma allow for the exchange of gases, for gas exchange. But guess what else can also get out? Not glucose. CO2 comes in. Water. Where does the plant bring water from? The roots. Okay? So when people are watering the leaves of their plants, they're completely defeating the purpose, because the leaves don't absorb water. They repel water. They have a waxy coat. The water for a photosynthetic organism, namely a plant, is absorbed through the roots, the bottom. And so what direction does it have to travel? Up. It has to travel up. And where's the food produced in a plant? In the leaves. So it has to travel down. In 1407, that's truly a concept we study. We spend multiple chapters on plants. And we talk about how food travels down and water travels up. And it's constantly going in that direction. But as the water travels up, once it gets to the tips, guess where it goes? Out. And that's a huge problem in our area. Why? Okay, it will eventually cause condensation, but what happens during most of our growth season? Why are we so dry? There's no rain. We're limited on that resource. So what do a lot of our plants that leave their pores open do? Die. They dehydrate. There are many plants in Texas that have evolved. They started with an adaptation and evolved the ability to close their pores during the day when it's hot and kind of slow down. And guess what they do as soon as the sun goes down? And bring in bunches of carbon dioxide and get rid of a whole bunch of oxygen. And then as soon as the sun comes up, they close. At the second part of this lecture, it talks about C4 and CAM plants. And those points will be brought up there. Okay? So this down here is for gas exchange, and this is with gas exchange with the environment. So we have a bunch of gases here, carbon dioxide and oxygen, spongy mesophyll, and then we have palisade mesophyll here, which is where the high levels of photosynthesis are carried out because these cells are so tightly organized and packed in to get as much benefit or access to the resource as possible. This is a summary of the 2 steps or 2 stages of photosynthesis. And I'm just introing them today. And on the second part, after we go through all the details, I actually come right back to this slide to show you that we've covered everything here. But the 2 stages of photosynthesis are referred to as light-dependent and light-independent. What do you think the difference is? One needs light, and the other one doesn't. That's the difference. One needs light, and the other one doesn't. Big picture, because it's all about the big picture when you get to start to study and you start to get confused. The light-dependent reactions, big picture, take photons, which is light energy, and turn it into ATP, which is chemical energy. Light-dependent reactions take photons, which is light energy, and turns it into chemical energy, ATP. Photosynthetic organisms cannot use photons for energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can transform. So step 1 is transforming light energy into chemical energy. Do you remember what I have to move back and forth in order to transfer? Electrons. So we're going to have an electron carrier, and I bet you can't guess, just kind of looking at light-dependent reactions, what my electron carrier will be. NADPH. What were my electron carriers for cellular respiration? FAD. This is a question, so I want to make sure that you understand that. My electron carriers for cellular respiration were NAD and FAD. And when they were reduced, came NAD and FAD H2. This was for cellular respiration only. For photosynthesis, I also have an electron carrier. It's NADP, and when it is reduced, it becomes NADPH. This is specifically for photosynthesis. I bet you can't venture to guess how I remember which one's for photosynthesis. Yeah, it has a P. I'm like, oh. If it has the P, I know that that's the electron carrier for photosynthesis. The electron carriers are specific to their process. Okay, but they all have the same job, and what is that? To carry electrons. Like, that's why they're called electron carriers. Yeah, that's what they do. Okay? So just, I kind of, you see both of those together so that you can reference that when you see a test question about different electron carriers. So step 1 is responsible for taking photon or light energy and transforming it into chemical energy, which is ATP. When we transform energy, we have to move electrons. So it has an electron carrier also involved. These reactions occur in the thylakoid membranes. Those are those green pancakes. The light-independent reactions are also referred to as the Calvin cycle with a capital C because the individual who discovered it wanted you to remember them. His name, yes. And what happens in the light-independent reactions is we take carbon dioxide and we reduce it into glucose. In the light-independent reactions, big picture, I'm going to take carbon dioxide and I'm going to reduce it to glucose. In the light-independent reactions, big picture, carbon dioxide will be reduced to glucose. Is reducing getting bigger or smaller? Bigger. Bigger. This process takes place in the stroma. This step takes place in the stroma. I will cover the other details, but I just kind of wanted to intro these two stages of photosynthesis, light-dependent and light-independent. Once again, light-dependent reactions take photon or light energy and turn it into ATP or chemical energy. The light-independent reactions take carbon dioxide and reduce it into glucose. Big picture. There are details, of course. But big picture, this is where we're going. Questions so far? Here is my chloroplast and a diagram to help indicate to one what the reactants and the products are for each set of reactions. So this collectively is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis has two parts, light-dependent and light-independent. Beginning with the light-dependent reactions, they occur in the thylakoid membranes. The reactants, or what go in, include water, ADP, NADP, sunlight, for reactants. What is produced during the light-dependent reactions? NADPH, ATP, and oxygen. So you can tell just by analyzing this diagram that this stuff goes in, accompanied by light, and those go out. These two products go directly into the light-independent reactions. What other reactant goes into light-independent? Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide comes in along with ATP and NADPH, comes into the light independent reactions, work together to reduce carbon dioxide into a sugar or glucose. That NADPH was just an electron carrier, so it dropped off its electron. Where is it going? Back to pick up another one. We use that ATP there, so it became ADP. Why is it going back over here? To get recharged again. Okay, this is all summary, just to kind of put your toes in the water or in the chloroplast so that you have an idea what's going on. Last question for this slide. What time of the day do the light-dependent reactions have to be conducted? When it's light time. If there has access to light, light-dependent reactions are occurring. What about the light-independent reaction? All the time. Because they don't need light. So day or night. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about light. When we talk about photosynthesis or photosynthetic organisms, we talk about that they use light to make food, or they use light energy that is eventually converted to food. So when we talk about light, first of all, there's different wavelengths. But the visible light spectrum, meaning what you and I can see, is very small. We can see anywhere from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. And this is our Roy G. Biv, our color spectrum here. 400 nanometers are very short wavelengths. 700 nanometers are longer wavelengths. And you can kind of see how the colors fade as the wavelengths get longer. The shorter the wavelength, the more powerful. The shorter the wavelength, the more powerful, or the more energy is harnessed there. The longer the wavelength, there's still energy, it's just not as powerful as the shorter wavelength. Let's hypothesize. If you were a plant, what color light would you grow best in? This is a risk-free environment. You shan't be judged whether you're right or wrong. Between 500 and 600? A 550 and 600? Okay. Any other takers? 700? Okay. Before we make further hypotheses, let's answer a question. Why is the sky blue? It reflects blue. And what does it do with all these other colors? It absorbs them. The sky is blue because it reflects blue, and it absorbs all the other colors. Why is her jacket black? It absorbs all the colors and reflects none, which is why black tends to be hotter, because it's absorbing everything. What about white? It reflects everything. So why are chloroplasts green? They absorb what? So why are they green? Okay, they do absorb the sun's heat. What wavelengths of light do they absorb? Why is the sky blue? It reflects blue. Why is that green? It reflects green. So what does it absorb? All the other colors. Keep that in your head. your head. So my visible light ranges anywhere from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. This is what I just said in writing. The photons are how we measure light. So we call it photons of light. We don't say ATP of light. We don't say that. The shorter the wavelength, the greater the energy. So plants have, let me rephrase that. Photosynthetic organisms have pigments. What is a pigment? It's a color. You and I have a pigment. Other organisms have pigments. So these photosynthetic organisms have pigments, and the purpose of a pigment is to absorb different wavelengths of light. The lighter the pigment, the less it absorbs. The darker the pigment, the more it absorbs. Does that make sense? Okay? So pigment molecules absorb certain wavelengths of light, and then they transmit or reflect other wavelengths of light, or other wavelengths. How do you know what wavelengths they reflect? By looking at the color. By looking at the color. So her jacket's green because it reflects green and absorbs all the other colors. Blue because it reflects blue and it absorbs all the other colors. You see where I'm going with this? Okay. So we have these pigment molecules that absorb certain wavelengths and reflect other wavelengths. I also talked about that when light hits a pigment, you can feel it. When the sunlight touches you, do you feel it? Yes. It's heat energy that's being transferred. And when energy is transforming, what's moving around? Electrons. And when the light hits it, it excites electrons. And so what do we need to do with those electrons that are trying to escape? Catch them. And in order to catch them, we need our electron carrier. So I actually spelled it out on this slide, even though I kind of pre-taught it over there. So my electron carrier for photosynthesis is NADP. And remember, we represent electrons with either an E and a negative to show its negative charge, or you could also have H's. Okay, and I talked about that in cellular respiration, but just to remind you real quick, in case you're studying this and you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what you're talking about. Electrons might be represented like this, and they might be represented like this. Okay? So just, that's what that's referencing. Okay? How many electrons does a hydrogen ion have? If it's balanced, if it's brought one on, it wants two in its valence shell. You're exactly correct. So, pigments, they absorb certain wavelengths and they reflect others. Photosynthetic pigments include chlorophyll, which many people are familiar with, which is our greenish yellows, and then carotenoids. Carotenoids are the reddish-orangish pigments. Usually in this area we see reddish-oranges when our day is short. Photosynthetic organisms don't measure the nighttime, they measure daytime. How much light they have access to. So, when the day is shorter, we start to see carotenoids come out, which means that our leaves are turning an orangish, reddish color. When that's the case, what wavelengths are they reflecting? When they are an orangish, reddish color, what wavelengths are they reflecting? Orangish and reddish, yes. The longer wavelengths. During the time when those pigments are green, what light are we reflecting? Green, okay? So now that you know that, which wavelength or what color of light, let me keep it like that, would plants grow the best in? Okay, the 5 to 550. Any other takers? The light, the color of wavelength that they're most comfortable? Yes, that makes sense. But what color is that? It could range. We have 400 to 700. Where do you think photosynthetic organisms like to be the most? So why are they green? Because they reflect green. And the shorter the wavelength, the more powerful, the longer the wavelength, the less, it's still got energy, just not as much. Okay? So if I was a photosynthetic organism and I had chlorophyll as my pigment, I would be a greenish color. What light do I want to be in? Can you tell me why it's not 550? What does it do with green light? It reflects it. So if it reflects it, it doesn't absorb. Why does it reflect green? It absorbs the rest. It's green because it reflects green. The shirt's blue because it reflects blue. These plants or these photosynthetic organisms that have chlorophylls as their main pigment, because they reflect green, don't grow well in green light because they reflect it. So what color light do they grow the best in? Why blue and not reddish orangish? Okay. This has a longer wavelength, so it's a little bit less powerful. Right here, you have what we call the absorption spectrum. This means this is what a photosynthetic organism would absorb if they had the chlorophyll pigment. So listen to what I'm saying. You have a photosynthetic organism. When I put it in blue or violet lights, it thrives. Because these are short, powerful wavelengths, and they're not green, so they're being absorbed. Where the wavelengths are a little bit longer, it matches the color of my pigment. So if it matches the color of my pigment, I don't absorb them. I reflect them, so I do no work because I'm reflecting all that light. But here I am. I can absorb this wavelength of light, but the wavelengths are a little bit longer. So even though I can still work under those conditions, I'll probably work best in the shorter wavelength. The reason why I didn't just give you the answer at the beginning is because if I talk you through this right now, it will help you answering the test questions. So what type of light do we not want plants to grow in? Green. And what type of light or what color or wavelength is most beneficial? The 4 to 500 range-ish, let's say 4 to 450-ish. That's a lot of plants are grown with black light. And when we use a black light, it peaks its levels of photosynthesis. That's where we end today. Any questions?
Not right now.
You're processing?
Yeah.
I get it.